Welcome everyone to our Sawtooth software webinar. Do segmentation like the pros. Avoid these three key mistakes by our esteemed Chrzan, Senior VP of Sawtooth Analytics, our consulting team here at Sawtooth. Uh, Excited to have everybody out today and hope you enjoy the webinar. Let's get started with some details here. We are all here in Zoom, and you'll notice that there's a Q&A section at the bottom of Zoom that you can ask questions. We prefer that you don't use the chat, and you can ask questions during the webinar. Brian McEwen from Sawtooth is here with us, and he'll be helping us answer some of the questions kind of behind the scenes. We might actually, Keith might pause to answer a few questions, but at the end, we will have a section for Q&A, so we can ask questions then as well. We always get asked this, but we always send out the recording of the webinar to everybody who registers. And in this case, Keith is also sharing his slides. So we'll be sharing both slides and the recording. In addition, these are posted on our website afterwards. I'm going to get here in a second on Chrzan, but first I would like to announce a few upcoming events. Our next webinar is Beyond the Grid, Complex Generative AI Stimuli and Conjoint Measurement, presented by Jeff Dodson from The Ohio State University. Following month in March 27th, we will have Brian McEwen from Sawtooth present a class, Mastering the Basics of Conjoint, beginner-friendly introduction. We've had so much success with these beginner conjoint courses. It's a great time to review the basics or send some of your colleagues that might be newer to conjoint for a beginner kind of tutorial there. So put that on your calendar. Also on May 6th, we will be having, May 7th through 9th down in New Orleans, we'll be having our Sawtooth Research Conference. You can see that at the bottom there. And then the day before on May 6th, we have kind of pre-conference workshops. So we have a choice modeling essentials workshop and a turbo choice modeling workshop, both there on May 6th. So please put all this on your calendars. If you go to sawtooth.com/resources/events, you can register for the conference and sign up for these webinars. If you aren't familiar with Sawtooth software, we encourage you to check out our platform. We have a powerful survey platform. We're really good at conjoint analysis and max diff. We're easy to use and have incredible support. And you can try us out for free if you go to discover.sawtoothsoftware.com. Okay, with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Chrzan. He's a really nice guy and really enjoy working with him. SVP of Sawtooth Analytics which is our consulting team. Keith, maybe when Keith jumps on, he can explain to us a little bit about what Sawtooth Consulting does and how they can be of service to you. Keith has 40 years of experience in the marketing research industry. He has experience working for 2 manufacturers, 3 marketing research suppliers, and a management consulting firm before he came here to Sawtooth almost 13 years ago. He writes a lot and speaks a lot about choice modeling topics and segmentation. If you come to our conference in New Orleans, you can meet him in person. Great guy. With that, Keith, if you'd like to turn on your camera and share your screen, you can take it away.
All right. Thanks, Justin.
Hey, before you start, could you just give us a little bit of intro of what Sawtooth Consulting, Sawtooth Analytics does?
Yeah, sure. So sure thing. Okay. Well, hopefully you can see my PowerPoint slides.
Not yet.
Uh-oh. Well, I'll have to work on that in a second. Okay, so I can tell you what Sawtooth, the consulting division of Sawtooth Software does projects for clients. So we use our software, any other software that's appropriate, usually R or SPSS or something. And we do choice modeling and segmentation and driver analysis projects for clients. Most of my clients are marketing research firms, and but occasionally we do work for end clients as well. So happy to help anybody who needs it.
Cool. Thanks, Keith.
Okay. So I'm trying to share. Okay, it says I'm screen sharing now. Hopefully you can see
Yeah.
my PowerPoint now. Okay,
Yeah. Go
great.
in presentation mode there and we're good.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
great.
So, all right, so we'll go ahead and get going here. I know we've got a limited amount of time, and I got a fair number of slides. So, and I want to leave time for Q&A at the end. So the title of the talk is avoiding 3 key mistakes in segmentation analysis. And just by way of background, segmentation is our way of putting respondents, survey respondents, into groups such that the people within a group are similar to one another, and the people in different groups are dissimilar from one another. Just a pretty standard definition of what segmentation is. Justin mentioned I've been doing this for a lot of years, and for almost all of that time, I've been doing segmentation studies. And I think segmentation studies are in a lot of ways one of the hardest things that research analysts have to work on. And so I want to talk about, there's a lot of reasons I think they're difficult studies. When I thought about how could I do a 1-hour webinar that had the most bang for the buck, I thought I would focus on fixing 3 common mistakes, 3 things that we as research designers and analysts do to shoot ourselves in the foot and make our job even harder with segmentation. So we're going to talk about how to avoid those mistakes. And it turns out that if we fix those 3 mistakes, we get 3 other benefits as well. So that's what we're talking about today. So here's there's a day-long version, a day-long seminar I give in segmentation. And the first part of it, we cover all these things that can go wrong with a segmentation study. And it's a long list that we're not going to focus on today. I really want to focus on just these 3. And they all have to do with the kind of variables that we use for segmentation. So it's kind of a group or a cluster of problems that we have here that we're going to try to fix. We're going to try to avoid having masking variables and correlated variables in our analysis, and we're going to try to avoid using variables that are subject to response bias. When we do that, we're going to solve these other 3 problems for free. And so let me just briefly go over what these problems are. Masking variables, when we do a segmentation analysis, there's a set of variables that we use to create the segments. They're called basis variables. And then all the other variables available to us in the study are profiling variables that we can use to profile and understand our segment. But the variables that we actually use to make our segments are called basis variables. If we include, as part of our basis variables, some variables that don't differ across segments, they make the cluster structure hard to find. In other words, they mask the structure. And so some empirical work that we've done shows that sure enough, if you have masking variables and you input them to your cluster algorithm, you will have a harder time finding the segments that are there. So we want to avoid making this problem for ourselves. If we can just avoid this problem by not including masking variables, and we'll talk about how to find them and how to disinclude them. Likewise, redundant variables, and this is a little bit counterintuitive. When I first saw this in 2021, I was working on a conference paper with my friend Joseph White, and we noticed that having redundant variables in our analysis actually made the segments harder to find and not easier to find. And it's a little bit counterintuitive if you come from kind of a psych background and you think about getting repeated measures on things and having some partially redundant variables, and they make your factor analysis better and your measures more reliable. Turns out that while all that is true in psychometrics, it's a bad thing in segmentation. And so we want to avoid redundant variables if we can. Another problem is having too small of a sample size. Because if your sample size is too small, it's going to be hard to find small segments. In fact, the recommendations are that for a study with 20 basis variables and up to 5 segments, 2 recent published suggestions would be that you need 1,000 or 2,000 respondents for those for that particular study. So Obviously, the more and in both of those, the number of basis variables, D there, is a critical multiplicative component. So if you can reduce the number of variables, you can reduce the problem of having too small a sample size. There's another problem apart from sample size, just having too many variables. I mean, if you think about it, let's say we had a group of people, and let's say we just took one variable, like eye color, right? People can have light eyes or dark eyes. If we could separate our people into two groups, we can do that very reliably, and everybody in the one group has dark eyes, and everybody in the other group has light eyes. But now let's add a second variable. Let's talk about how tall people are. So now we want to divide people into groups where they differ on eye color and height. And now to really do a complete job, even if height was a binary variable, it was tall or short, and then we had light and dark eyes, we'd need 4 groups. As you add variables, but don't keep raising the number of don't keep doubling the number of groups. If you raise the number of variables, what's going to happen is that all of your it's going to be very hard to produce segments that have high and low scores on all the variables. It might hit some of the variables, but not all of them. And if you add enough variables in, you end up with a problem called the curse of dimensionality. The best quote I've read about this is in the context of segmentation, if you have too many dimensions, it causes every observation in your data set to appear equidistant from all the others. If the distances are all about equal, then all the observations are equally alike and equally different, and no meaningful clusters can be formed. I've seen this problem happen so many times over the years where I had a bunch of variables and I ran some segments, and then my segments just didn't differ very much. And it never really occurred to me that it was my problem was I was throwing too many variables in my analysis. In most cluster analysis and latent class programs, you can throw as many variables as you want. If you want to throw 500 variables in the analysis, it'll run with 500 variables, no problem. And so I think a lot of people, me included, thought, well, that's great. I don't have to worry about the number of variables. In fact, we do, because it causes this common problem. And then lastly, the last problem I want to talk about is response bias. Especially if we're doing segmentation based on rating scales, we all know that people use rating scales differently. Some people are high raters and some people are low raters. And that creates an artifact in the way people use this artifact in the way that people use rating scales really, can masquerade as segment structure. I can think, oh, I run my cluster diagnostics and I say, oh, I've got a great 2-cluster solution here. And I look at them, well, I got a cluster of high raters and a cluster of low raters. That tells me nothing. So in fact, this particular problem, response bias, it ruins so many segmentation studies that I'm going to spend the first half of today's session talking about it. And so just to illustrate here, I took some actual respondents. These aren't their actual names because I don't want to share personally identifiable information or anything like that. So we'll just call this respondent Socrates here. When Socrates answers this rating scale question about what kind of vacation he'd like to go on, he answers like this. There's some things that are extremely important to him, some things that are unimportant to him. Doesn't care that it's a family-friendly, sort of vacation-oriented, a family-friendly sort of place, not important to him at all. He just wants to be relaxed. He's a bit of a cheapskate, so he doesn't want it to be expensive. And he's interested in historical attractions and having a beach and things like that. When we look at Smith's ratings, and again, this is a real study, and this is a real person here, Smith, although that wasn't Smith's name either. Smith does what a lot of our survey respondents do. Smith only used part of the rating scale. For Smith, everything was at least somewhat important. In fact, we used a rating scale that allowed Smith to tell us that everything was important, and Smith just did exactly what we allowed him to do. He said, I want all these things in my vacation. And then we're still, of course, the opposite extreme from Socrates is Bubba. I think if you look at a lot of real data sets, you'll find more Bubbas than you will Socrateses. Bubba here tells us that everything is important. You wonder a little bit about Bubba because he wants a family-friendly vacation that's also adult-oriented. So you wonder if Bubba even read the question, but this is the way Bubba answered. And again, you'll see a lot of people like Bubba. So what's the difference here? The difference between these three folks, or at least one difference between them, is that there's a response bias. They're answering the questions differently. And a response bias is a systematic tendency to respond to a range of questionnaire items on some basis other than the content of those items. And you can see that here. Bubba just agreed with everything. Not even clear that he read the questions. So what we've got here is people answering with three different kinds of response styles here. We got someone who's using the whole scale, someone who's using part of the scale, and someone who's using only 1 point on the scale. Cluster analysis is going to pick that up and call those different groups of people. That's the problem. So one of my cautions is that when we're doing segmentation studies, it's a pretty good idea to stay away from rating scales, especially agreement scales that sometimes people incorrectly call Likert scales, agree-disagree scales, let's say on a 5 or 7 point scale or something, and importance rating scales. Those are two that are really good to stay away from because, again, different people use rating scales in different ways. And you'll see this if you do cross-cultural comparisons, that people in different countries use rating scales differently. But you can look at it even within a single culture. If you looked at people even within the United States, and the three respondents I just shown you were from the United States, here we've got response bias operating differently within a single culture. In addition, a lot of times rating scales aren't terribly discriminating, particularly importance scales. And importance scales in particular, although I see them used a lot in segmentation, we as an industry, the marketing research industry, have known or should have known for the past 50 years that importance rating scales have no predictive validity. In fact, they have less than 0 predictive validity. You wouldn't think it's possible, but there's three papers that were published over 50 years ago now in the Journal of Marketing Research, our industry's premier journal, that told us how bad importance ratings are. And still, I think I see multiple questionnaires every week come across my desk where people want to measure importance ratings. And so kind of a pet peeve, I just want to mention that here. They're terrible scales to use for any reason, especially for segmentation. So, especially when there's better examples. And I'm going to show you one in a minute. We really need to, if we're doing a segmentation, rather than give people a scale where they can exhibit response bias, we need to constrain their responses in some way. And one of the ways that we like is something called best-worst scaling, or max diff. And I'll show you what max diff is in just a minute. Basically, we create an experimental designs that shows subsets of our attributes in a balanced way. In each question, respondents pick one best and one worst option from their subset. And we do some statistical analysis that quantifies the relative value of each item included in the experiment for each respondent. Max diff capitalizes on what human brains do well. I can tell you on the savanna of Africa, we didn't evolve as a species because we answered rating scale questions well. We evolved as a species because we made good choices. We knew when to hide from lions and when to chase gazelles and whatnot, okay? We're good at that. We're not good at using rating scales. I suspect in the history of humankind, no one has ever selected a mate, for example, on the basis of their ability to use rating scales. I would certainly hope not. What we do well, however, is we make choices. So if we give people a list of things and just ask them which one is most important to them and which one is least important, which one is the most blue and which one is the least blue, which one is the most of anything and which one is the least of anything, people do a pretty good job of that. We could give, now we're going to recast this questionnaire as if our vacation questionnaire had been about, had been done as a max diff, and the questions would look at like this. All we're doing in each question, and it doesn't matter if you're a high rater or a low rater, or what country you come from. If you come from a country full of people who have this acquiescence bias where they like to agree with everything, not possible here. Every single person who takes this survey has to pick one most important thing and one least important thing from this list. I like max diff because it's information rich. Think about it. With 2 mouse clicks here, we've collected 5 pieces of information, right? So if by telling people that when this respondent says that the most important thing is that it's a beach location, we know that beach is more important than the other 3 attributes. And then the additional mouse click that being inexpensive is the least important, we now learn about 2 other pairs, right? That we know that adult-oriented and having outdoor activities are more important than price to this person. So we learned about 5 paired comparison preferences from just 2 mouse clicks. That's what I mean about it being information rich. Again, we've got a constrained response format, so the results are going to be comparable across cultures and between individuals. MaxDiff's been found to be more discriminating, to have better discriminant validity than importance rating scales, and better predictive validity than importance rating scales. So it's just a nice measure to use. And I thought, just to beat this dead horse, I would actually show you an empirical study of what happens if we use rating scales instead of MaxDiff. So now we've got a study of 1,284 casual dining restaurant customers. Our questionnaire included importance ratings on 10 casual dining restaurant attributes and a MaxDiff of the same 10 restaurant attributes. We did two different segmentations here. We used a latent class analysis based on the importance ratings, and I'll show you that in a minute. And then we used something called a latent class multinomial logit choice model on the MaxDiff data to segment on that. And here's what happened. If I do a segmentation on the rating scales themselves, these were 5-point rating scales, I think, we get what you will almost always get if you use rating scales. We've got a segment of high raters in segment 2, a segment of low raters in segment 1, and a segment in between there in segment 3, people who seem to use more of the scale, not just the high end and not just the low end. From a research standpoint, this is uninteresting. All we've done is segment people on the basis of how they use rating scales. We can't market to them any differently. We don't know who values what more than what. All we know is that these people use rating scales differently. Pretty uninteresting stuff. I know once upon a time it was suggested to me that, well, you know, we can subtract out that rating scale bias just by subtracting each respondent's mean rating from all of the respondents' ratings and then cluster on that centered data. And here's what happens if we do. Now we have 3 segments, again, came from the cluster analysis. Here's our 3-segment solution. But look, instead of having high, medium, and low raters, we've got people with high variance on the rating scale, people with low variance, and people in between. So now instead of the mean, we haven't segmented people on their mean ratings anymore. We've segmented in terms of their variance, which is at least as unhelpful as segmenting them on the means was. Again, just when we subtract out the means, we didn't solve our problem. We still have rating scale bias affecting our results here. On the other hand, when we do the latent class MaxDiff model, we get what I think are 3 more interesting segments here. We've got some segments who are high and low on everything. In fact, we've got what I think looks like a really price-sensitive segment there in segment 1. We should point out that everybody cared about the taste of food. Nobody goes to a restaurant to get bad-tasting food, right? But you take that out, forget the taste of the food because everyone's about the same on that. And segment 1 pops really because they really care about price a lot more than anything else besides taste. They care about price. Segment 2 is kind of an interesting one. They seem to be interested in the safety of the food they're eating. So they're more interested. What's really important to them, other than taste, which is again important to everyone, is that the food be served at the right temperature and that the restaurant be clean. And then the 3rd segment, of course, a little bit different from both of those, they really seem to be interested as well in the quality of the service that they're getting. So not only the taste of the food, but they also want their server to be attentive and friendly, which is something you don't see in the other segments. So anyway, I think a more useful segment, just to illustrate that I think you can get more useful segments if you can avoid using measures that have scale bias. I don't want to suggest that MaxDiff is the only way to do this. You could do a very similar thing with something called a Q-sort that we won't talk about today, but that I use sometimes in segmentation studies. I know rating scales are hard to get rid of, and I think part of that is because a lot of us were trained or come at this from a psychological standpoint. But instead of using agree-disagree scales or importance ratings, I think we should really maybe think about using something like semantic differential scales. I've just found those to be a little bit less subject to rating scale bias, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And then there's a prominent book on segmentation that really recommends binary scales. So let's talk about those. Semantic differential scale looks like this. They're basically multi-point scales with opposite verbal anchors on the endpoint. So rather than ask someone, how much do you agree or disagree that you're introverted? We ask them a scale that goes from introverted to extroverted. And now it's not like someone who has an agreement bias. I mean, which is agreeing? Is the right-hand side agreeing or is the left-hand side agreeing? There's there's not as much room for an acquiescence bias to affect things here. So again, it's a rating scale. Maybe we'll have some people who use wider parts of the scale and some people who use narrower parts. But I just haven't found these semantic differential scales to be as problematic as simple rating scales are. Simple rating scales are just a great way to shoot yourself in the foot if you're doing segmentation. Binary scales could just be a yes-no version of this, right? We could just have a 2-point scale. Are you introverted or extroverted? Are you excitable or calm? Are you career-oriented or family-oriented? With 2-point scales. That would be one way of doing it. If you had a list of items, though, you could also think about doing a paired comparison experiment. So you'd ask, you'd basically, ask different pairs of items, and you'd end up asking 1.5 times as many pairs as you had items on your list. You could think about this as being the simplest possible case of max diff, right? So, except we're not even going to have, once people tell us which one's the better of the two, we already know which one's the less good of the two. It's an old method called the method of paired comparisons. Dates back to the 1920s, works really, really well. Again, it works well because it does what the human brain does well. It allows us to make choices. And we are choosers. It's what we do. We're not raters. It's not what we're made to do. Okay, so we've talked about one of the three problems, addressing the rating scale bias. And again, this is kind of an own goal that we do to ourselves as researchers. We put scales that don't lend themselves to segmentation into segmentation studies, and then we're surprised when our studies don't work. Well, we shouldn't be. Make better decisions, and you'll have better segmentation studies. Here's a flow chart that I use that helps me think about the whole segmentation process and what kind of segmentation I'm going to be doing. Don't really want to focus on this, except I want to talk about variable selection as being the way to solve the other two problems that we talked about. Masking variables and correlated variables are both things we can take care of if we add this step to our segmentation process called variable selection. So I mentioned it's specifically focused on two of the problems above, identifying masking variables and identifying correlated variables or redundant variables. And again, if we identify these variables and remove them, we're going to ameliorate our problems with sample size, with having too many variables, and with being subject to the curse of dimensionality. We can solve all of those problems as well if we do a good job of getting rid of masking variables and correlated variables. There's several ways to do this. I'll describe a couple. There's some manual ways to do it. So if you just want to use methods you're familiar with and you've got cluster analysis software or latent class software, or you can run discriminant analysis in SAS or SPSS, you can do these methods without learning anything really new. There's a couple of automated search programs which work much, much better, and a method called unsupervised random forest that we'll talk about very briefly. Okay, so the manual variable selection methods work like this. First off, we're going to cluster analyze our data with whatever set of basis variables we want to start with. So maybe our client comes and says, hey, I've got this list of 47 basis variables. We look at that and we think to ourselves, oh my God, this is a real garbage can of a thing. They didn't really have a lot of self-control. They just wanted to throw everything in the kitchen sink in the segmentation analysis. But okay, let's go ahead and do it for them. So we cluster analyze the data just like as if we didn't know that variable selection was important. But then we do one of two things. We could either run a stepwise discriminant analysis, and what that's going to do is we're going to use segment membership as our group variable that we're going to use and that's the thing we're going to predict with our stepwise discrim. And then from that stepwise discriminant analysis, the one variable in the first step, the one single variable that does the best job of discriminating among our segments is going to pop out. It's significant. It's going to be identified. And in the next part of the stepwise procedure, the next most significant one is going to enter the analysis, and so on until no more variables are significant predictors of segment membership. So think about what we did there. If we had redundant variables in the mix, once we pull one of the redundant ones in, then the other redundant ones don't add significantly to the prediction and they won't enter the discrim. That's a good thing. Think about if we had masking variables in there. If we have variables in our basis variables that contributed to our segmentation, but that are unrelated to our segments, they also won't enter the stepwise discriminant analysis. So the stepwise discrim should be helping us get rid of both redundant variables and masking variables. And when it does that, when we start off with our 47 variables and then we end up after the stepwise discrim with just 8 of them, now we redo our cluster analysis with just those 8 variables in it as basis variables. We will, with the stepwise discrim, have done variable selection. And as a result, we've gotten rid of we've gotten rid of our masking variables. We've gotten rid of our correlated variables. We've taken a lot of pressure off our sample size. We've greatly reduced the number of variables, and we've reduced our chances of being hit with the curse of dimensionality because we went from 47 variables down to 8. So that's one manual way you can do it with tools you probably already have. If you're doing your own segmentation studies, you've got software that does cluster analysis and discrim. A slightly more laborious method would be to go ahead and do your cluster analysis with your 47 variables, look at the results and say, of these 47 variables, which ones are significant in my segmentation? If I run an F statistic or something, or if I run the statistics that are involved when I run latent class analysis, they'll tell me which of my predictors which of my segmentation variables are significant and which ones aren't. If we drop all the ones with non-significant differences across segments, we're going to get rid of all of our redundant variables that way, okay? Or all of our masking variables that way. This method doesn't really get rid of redundant variables, but it does get rid of masking variables, which are, of the two, I think, much more damaging. Once we've gotten rid of those variables, we cluster analyze again with the reduced set. We again check to see if there's any that are non-significant, and if we do, we drop them. We go through that a few times until we stop dropping variables, and then we're done. We say, this has been our variable selection process. So those are two methods we can do today. A couple of years ago, Joseph White and I did a conference paper where we compared these manual variable selection methods, things we'd done over the years, with some new programs we found in R that automate the process. And two of them, one's called clustvarcell. It's available when you've got metric variables. So if all of our variables were rating scale variables or counts or percents, if they weren't categorical, then we can use clustvarcell. And it does a really good job of getting rid of both masking variables and correlated variables. The other one is called varcell LCM, variable selection for latent class modeling. And it works when you've got a mixture of metric and categorical variables, or when you have only categorical variables in your data set. So it's another program you can use in R. I'm not going to demonstrate these. We don't really have time for that today. If you're not an R user, well, I think these methods are better than the ones on the previous page, but the ones on the previous page are certainly better than nothing. So whether you're an R user or not, you've got some tools to use for variable selection. If you are an R user, at the appendix at the end of this presentation, you can get the slides from Justin will be sending those out, is the R code for running these methods. So you've got that. After Joseph and I worked on that paper, I became aware of another method for identifying, for culling the list of potential basis variables, for doing this variable selection. And it was something called an unsupervised random forest. Now, if you're familiar with random forests, when I say the words unsupervised random forest, it might sound like an oxymoron because a random forest is just a large number of decision trees that have been randomly perturbed in a couple of important ways. But each decision tree has a dependent variable that's causing the splits to happen in the tree. So for instance, if we wanted to predict people's willingness to spend on some category on the basis of their demographics, the dependent variable, the supervising variable, is their willingness to spend. And then the tree would basically split our sample into by the variables that differentiate who's willing to spend more stuff. So maybe the first split in the tree might be income, because higher income people can afford to spend more stuff. And then maybe the next split in the tree would be based on the respondent's age or whether they had kids or not. Maybe people without kids are able to spend more money or whatever. It would build this whole tree that separates into more and more distinct groups of people with higher or lower income or lower spend propensity or whatever. So if you build a forest out of these trees, each tree is supervised, it initially might not make sense that your tree is that your random forest is unsupervised. So let me explain to you how it works. So basically, we've got our segmentation data. We don't have any dependent variable in our segmentation, but we've just got our 47 variables that the client said, here, segment with these. What the unsupervised random forest does, its first step is it makes a copy of the data of your data file, but then it randomly and independently sorts each column of data. So if column A and B were correlated in your original data, once we resort each one of those two randomly and independently, any correlations between A and B are broken now because this random sorting broke them. So the copy data set has the same univariate distributions on all variables, but all the relationships between variables are now broken in the copy data set. And now we're going to add the copy, we're just going to append the copy data set, or we're going to concatenate the copied data set and the original data set, and we're going to add one new variable to our data set. It's going to be 1 if it's the original data set, and 2 if it's the copy data set. So our new variable, and that's what the random forest is going to predict. So it really isn't unsupervised. It's supervised by that variable that tells us whether the observation is from the original data set or the broken data set, the copied broken data set. The idea here is that what the random forest is going to identify are the variables that are related to the structure that exists in the data. So we run our random forest analysis. It's going to give us it could give us a proximity matrix. It's going to give us a proximity matrix that tells us how far apart all of our points are, which we could all by itself. We could take that proximity matrix and enter it into a cluster analysis program like hierarchical clustering or partitioning around medoids, say. Or we can look at the importances themselves and say, let's use those importances for variable selection. So just for example, here's a recent study I had with lots and lots of variables in it. I think there were 90 candidate variables. So I had my random forest run. I had it rescale everything to sum to 100%. And it told it, from the top, the biggest, most important attribute had 2.49% importance. The least important ones way down there at the bottom had 0 importance. Usually we pick a cutoff that's twice the expected percentage. So just for example, if we had 100 items, we'd expect the average item to have an importance of 1%. So we might set the cutoff at 2. In this case, with 90 candidate variables, the cutoff was 2.22, and we'd end up using only the top 10 variables here on this chart is what we would use for the as our basis variables going forward. So that's using an unsupervised random forest to do that variable selection for us. So my recommendation is we've really found that the automatic variable selection methods and the unsupervised random forest do a better job of variable selection. They both do better than the manual variable selection methods. But if you don't have access to R, you're not comfortable using these newer methods, certainly using the manual methods are better than nothing. So that kind of brings us to a summary here. We addressed these 3 problems, okay? First, we talked about response bias and ways of getting rid of it. We said, response bias is a problem we make for ourselves by using variables that have poor scaling properties that don't lend themselves well to segmentation. And if we can avoid things like simple rating scales like agree, disagree scales or importance scales, and either use a method that involves trade-offs like max diff, or even something like semantic differential scales. If we make wiser choices about scales, we're very much less likely to end up with segments of high, medium, and low raters because those are really uninformative. Unless the goal of our segmentation is to find out how people use rating scales, and no client has ever paid me to find out how people use rating scales, we want to stay away from those kind of ratings. The other 2 problems we addressed were masking variables and correlated variables. And we said the way to address that problem is through adding a step called variable selection to our segmentation analysis. Now, again, this isn't variable selection in the sense of, hey, let's look at the variables and see which one makes sense. That should have even been done before. Someone should say, what are the objectives of my study? Let's pick the variables that make sense. But after that, we probably still need to think about, well, are any of the variables that we've selected masking variables that are just going to hide the structure? Or are they correlated variables that's going to make the structure hard to find? Let's identify those with this variable selection analysis and get rid of them and cut down on the number of variables. It's going to also decrease the pressure on sample size. It's going to be one of these 3 free things we get at the bottom of the page. It's going to reduce the problem of having too many variables and of getting slapped with the curse of dimensionality. So anyway, that's my quick bang for the buck, how to fix some problems that help you fix other problems, and there you go. There's a bunch of references here. Everything I've referred to in the slides is here in the references section. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Justin.
Thanks so much, Keith. I'm going to just share my screen real quick. And we will get to the Q&A here in just a moment. Just a reminder of some upcoming Sawtooth events. Beyond the Grid webinar, February 20th, talking about generative AI stimuli. Very interesting. March 27th, Mastering the Basics of Conjoint for Brian McEwen. And then May 6th, we have our pre-conference workshops down in New Orleans. And May 7th through 9th, the Sawtooth Research Conference. You can see information about all of this at sawtooth.com/events. And then, yeah, just a reminder, if you're new to Sawtooth, want to check us out, check out discover.sawtoothsoftware.com and check out our tools. So with that, Brian McEwen, you've been on the Q&A. If you want to turn on your camera, and I think Brian's going to basically help lead us through some of these questions. Keith, can you also see the questions there in the Q&A section?
I cannot. Oh, I could open the Q&A section. That would probably help. Okay. Yes, I can see them.
Yeah, I'll guide you through a couple here. We had a couple people ask about the idea of finding the golden questions and building a typing tool. Can you do that with a MaxDiff?
Actually, you can. There's 2 different ways you can do it. Traditionally, you could use the MaxDiff utilities to calculate how each respondent would have answered to any possible paired comparison. And then you could use those as predictors in a stepwise discriminant analysis. That's traditionally what we've done. An even better idea, or I think something that works better, is Sawtooth Software has a MaxDiff typing tool software. It's a DOSy piece of software that was developed for internal use, but if you're interested in it, get in touch with us and we can, it's got good documentation, but again, it's a DOSy thing. It doesn't have a sexy user interface. We never thought there would be enough of a market to turn it into a commercial product. So it's something that we allow interested people to use if they want. And if they like it, they can pay us whatever they like. So it's not something that even has necessarily a price tag on it, other than what you think the software is worth. I found it to work extremely well. But because we're not exactly sure how that method compares with that discriminant analysis method I just talked about, we're actually going to be doing a paper at the Turbo event that Justin mentioned the day before our main conference in New Orleans. We're going to be doing a paper comparing those 2 ways of doing typing tools or coming up with the golden questions for a MaxDiff based segmentation. So see you there.
Yeah. We'll also plug a little bit. We did have a question about running latent class. The latent class analysis that we do, both for conjoint and MaxDiff, does have a nice user interface that is nice in just a couple clicks, and you can run, 1 to 5 group solutions and compare them and things like that. So that is available. If you're interested in latent class, MaxDiff, the typing tool, you could go ahead and send an email into support at sawtooth.com. And we can route you to the right person depending on what you're interested in. Let's go back to the Q&A here. Can you talk about your opinion on running a factor analysis on MaxDiff results?
Well, at some length I could talk. I have a lot of opinions about factor analysis when it comes to MaxDiff or segmentation in general. The answer being don't do it. You could do it if you wanted. I mean, it's mathematically possible to do with MaxDiff results. You just have to drop one of the items to prevent your analysis from having a singularity. And then you could, I suppose, factor analysis on the rest, factor analyze the rest. Factor analysis is a psychometric technique that's used for developing and testing theories about measurement. And it's great at that. I've used MaxDiff. I published it, I published it actually doing factor analysis on MaxDiff results when I was working on a paper on psychometrics. The goal of segmentation, however, is almost completely different because factor analysis tells you that groups of variables are correlated. What we're trying to do with segmentation is find groups of respondents who are different from one another. See how those two sentences shared almost exactly no two words in common? Factor analysis is almost completely irrelevant to what cluster analysis wants to do. And so I really don't think it has any place as part of any segmentation analysis, period. Despite the fact that most of us learn to do it that way, I think it's the wrong thing to do. I think its goals are wrong. I think that what it does actually obscures segment structure more than it clarifies.
Awesome. Next question. Do you have any opinion about potentially mixing different types of questions? So rather than doing, say, everything as your semantic differentials or something, trying to shake things up and have different types of things for your segmentation.
We do it all the time, and that's the reason that when I talked about the two kinds of variable selection programs, I said one works if you've got only metric rating scales, and the other one works if you've got a mix of metric and categorical variables. Because if I look over the segmentations I've done in the past year, at least half, probably more than half, have involved combinations of metric and categorical variables. And I can think of some studies I've done that where the clients have come to me with more than 100 possible basis variables, 20 of them categorical and the other 80 or 90 being metric, and we need to do some variable selection, and that one automatic clustering routine does that just fine. So yeah, I think mixing, there's no reason not to mix different kinds of variables in segmentation analysis. Well, I guess if you only knew how to do cluster analysis and you didn't know how to use something called a Gower distance, you might convince yourself that you don't want to mix variable types because you can't. But if you've got the right skills, yes, you can certainly mix variable types.
Okay. Got kind of a broad question. It's prefaced by great stuff, Keith. What are your overall thoughts on supervised versus unsupervised in terms of how much we as researchers shape the segments beforehand, a priori, versus letting them fall out naturally?
I think the difference between supervised and unsupervised is entirely a difference in what our study objectives are. If we have a potential supervising variable and our goal is to find segments of people who differ significantly with respect to that variable, supervised segmentation makes sense. If we don't, if we've just got this garbage can of 30 or 40 or 80 variables and someone says, hey, make some segments, and we don't have a supervising variable, it should be unsupervised. So I don't think that's a decision. I think that's a decision we make based on the study objectives. I think both are, and I do plenty of both. I would say about 10% of my studies are supervised, and the other 90% are unsupervised. But I do both.
Right. Do you have an opinion about single code versus multi-code questions? So a single select versus a multi-select. Any thoughts or wisdom on those type of questions for segmentation?
I routinely use both of them for segmentation, so no real preference there. A multi-select is just turning, is just taking a single select and turning it into multiple binary variables. So I have no problem with that.
All right. There was a couple questions when you're talking about manual variable selection. One of them was, could one use multinomial logistic regression rather than discriminant analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned discrim, but there's no reason you couldn't do a polytomous logit. That's a viable solution as well as you could also do a supervised segmentation, right? You could build a decision tree there and use that to choose your variables. So you've got a lot of choices. I just mentioned discrim because I think it's the most common. Another thing to watch out for with the polytomous multinomial logit is if you don't have a really big sample size, you could see that some of your parameters kind of tend off to infinity. So you get some weird things happening with multinomial logit if your sample size isn't big enough. So just a caution there.
Another really good question. For beginners to segmentation, are there any particular resources that you would point people to start their journey?
There's, I mean, there's a free textbook. It's by Dolnikar, Grun, and Leash, 2018. It's listed in the references section there. It's a good general text. It gets pretty deep in spots, but it's a good introduction to the field of segmentation. And so it's also a very recent modern book about segmentation, which I think makes it valuable because it doesn't talk about a lot of outdated things. And it's also free, which is the third big benefit of the book. So I'd recommend that's a good place to start.
Hey, Brian, just jumping in real quick. Julie's wondering if today's presentation will be recorded. Yes, it's recorded, and we'll send it out to everybody who registered.
Oh, I should also say, if you're looking for easier to read references, the Sawtooth Software Conference, every year we publish our proceedings, and most years we have one or two articles about segmentation in the proceedings. So there's a lot of good stuff in there that dates back, some 30 years. There's some really nice papers over the years that we've had about segmentation. So.
Yeah, I would echo that. The Sawtooth proceedings tend to be a bit more practical. They're really good stuff. There's still a handful of questions. There's more coming in. I don't know, Keith, if maybe you want to take a look at any of the unanswered things, if any one or two more
Sure.
jump out at you.
Daniel asks, what about specific discriminant analysis methods do you recommend with latent class methods? And the answer is I usually just use a forward discrim, forward elimination, the forward selection process in my discrim, just because it runs a little bit faster than a backward discrim. And it seems to me more aligned with the goals that I have. So there's that. Let's see, would using the variable importances from a random forest clustering app be as useful as the method you described? I'm not sure what a random forest clustering is. I mean, you could take the proximity matrix from the random forest and load it into, say, a partitioning around medoids program and do clustering that way. But I'm not sure what random forest clustering is. So maybe it's something I'm not familiar with, which is great. I'd like to learn new things too. I'll actually look that up when we get off the call here. Let's see. The difference between variables used to define segments and those used to describe segments. Sure thing. Lori asked, I mentioned that basis variables are the variables we kind of throw into the segmentation machine to create segments, and all the other variables available to us are called profiling variables. And we're going to use those profiling variables, after the analyst has made the segments. We don't want to just, no one should just trust the analyst that those segments are going to be all that useful. What we really need to do is now take those cluster members, those segment memberships, put them in our crosstab program, and run all the other variables in our study by those potential segmentations and see which. So we might even oftentimes I'll come up with I'll say, oh, the statistics are pointing to a 3 and a 5 and a 6 segment solution. So we take those, we build them all into a set of crosstabs, and then we look at how those 3, 5, and 6 segment solutions compare on all the variables in our study. And maybe as we're looking at them, we're saying, oh, I would have expected, based on what we saw, on what I think these 3 segments mean, that this segment would tend to be older and this other one would be younger. And if we look at the data and when we look at those profiling variables, and it turns out not to be the case, maybe some of the stories that we were telling about the data start to fall apart. Or maybe when we're doing the profiling, we start to reinforce one of the studies as this one really looks like the credible answer here. So I think that those profiling variables have a lot to do in helping us validate the solutions we come up with and to choose among them. Because nowhere in segmentation statistics are there statistics as powerful as like a stat test that tells you something significant or it's not. There is no statistic that says, hey, you've got a 4-segment solution here. there are some hints that maybe the 4 segment solution fits pretty well, or maybe it's the 6 segment solution, but we never know for sure. And those profiling variables are, I think, an excellent way to help us make choices among solutions.
Back in my my intro to stats class, I think they use the terms statistical significance versus managerial significance, that it can depend sometimes.
Okay, someone asked, can we use factor analysis to whittle down the variables and then transition to the actual segmentation? I would say do that at your risk. In a longer version, in the day-long version of this, I show a case study where I used to tell people, don't use rating scales unless your rating scale battery was designed by psychometricians. Don't use it. Don't factor analyze it and use it in segmentation. And then later, I had a study that actually was designed by a team of psychometricians, and so I kind of had to eat my words there. And so I said, okay, well, I'll go ahead and factor analyze this, and then we'll do some segmentation. It turns out that there were 3 variables in the study that were cross-loading variables. That is, they loaded on multiple factors. And so from a factor analysis standpoint, we would typically identify those as being pretty uninteresting variables and throw them out. Turned out, those were the 3 variables that most differentiated among respondents and did the best job of being the basis for cluster analysis. So the exact decision we would have made on the basis of our factor analysis to throw those variables out would have led us down exactly the wrong path. So again, I just think that the objectives of factor analysis and the objectives of what we're doing in segmentation are so different that the former is irrelevant to, potentially even harmful to, the latter. Any thoughts on the useful life of a completed clustering? Depends on how dynamic your marketplace is. I used to work in the antacid category. At the time, that was a stable category. It was the same year in and year out. And I think we redid segmentations there like every 5 years. At a conference once, I brought that up, and someone said, well, you think that's a static category? The most static category they had ever found was dehumidifiers. If you live in a humid region of the country, like the Northeast, say, and you've got a basement and you don't want mold, you put a little machine down there called a dehumidifier. You buy it once, it sits in your house for as long as you own your house, and you never think about it again. And so that client told me they did a segmentation study once, and they would never need to do one again because the market was never going to change because, humidity and mold are what they are. Anyway, I think we're getting close to out of time, or do we have time for more?
I'm okay if you want to go a little longer, up to you, Keith, but we can go past the hour if you'd like.
Oh, well, clearly I can talk about this stuff all day long. Okay.
Typically, we do try to answer everybody's questions and go past the hour and just keep it on the recording. So people can take off if they need to, but we'll go a little longer.
Okay. Do we have any decision heuristics for choosing between variable selection methods? How do I decide when to use stepwise versus Varcel LCM versus random forest? To tell the truth, because I do program things in R, and because our empirical testing has shown that Varcel LCM, the automated variable selection methods like Varcel LCM, work better than stepwise. I wouldn't use a stepwise discrim or the other recursive approach. The 2 manual approaches I use that I talked about, I wouldn't use because our testing has shown that the automatic methods work better. I might use the random forest one as well, just because it gives me a handy visualization to show to my client when they ask me, why did you pick these variables? I can show them the unsupervised random forest importances and say, here's the variables I picked and here's why. So that's why that. Okay. Oh, Doug Malcolm said, oh, hi, Doug. Doug used to work with me at Merritt's Research. They've had good luck doing variable selection for mixed variable types with random forests, so he can attest to the approach. Well, thank you for the additional evidence. It also unlocks more potential improved solutions with more variables of whatever types. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Doug. Okay, let's see. For a discriminant with max diff, are the raw utilities used, or is there any transformation applied to them before utilizing them in modeling? No, we would use the raw variable. Well, it wouldn't matter if you were using the raw or transform variables, because all we're looking for in that discrim, we're going to build every possible paired comparison from the MaxDiff utility. So when I was talking about building a typing tool, I think that's what this question's about. So no, it wouldn't matter whether you transform them or not. If for purposes of the typing tool, using the raw utilities or transform ones would always point to the same winner for any paired comparison. So, but maybe I got that question wrong, Nick. If I did, go ahead and send me an email. My email address is right there, and we can talk about it offline. Okay. Let's see. In the example I showed, it showed that everyone was interested in taste. Would I rerun it and exclude that variable? Yes. If it were a study where I'd collected rating scales or something like that, I probably would. In that case, though, that was a latent class multinomial logit model. So it was a choice model that we built. And if you leave the variable out of the choice model, you're going to have some extra noise running around your model that you probably don't want. So in that particular case, with latent class multinomial logit, I would not suggest dropping what looked like it could be a masking variable, because I'm not sure exactly how I would do that. Okay. Josh asked, for the automated variable selection methods, do the variables need to be binary, or can you put in a mixture of variable types? Again, I pointed to two programs in R, one of which handles metric variables, one of which handles categorical variables or mixtures of variables. So I routinely use it when I've got combinations of rating scales, counts, binaries, multiple choice categoricals, and they handle all of those, any mixture you like. Okay, how low does an F score have to be before you consider it to be a masking variable? So if I'm looking at my cluster analysis results, let's say I've run the CCEA program in Sawtooth software, which is a really one of the particularly good clustering algorithms that we found. And you run your analysis and you look at their 5-segment solution or whatever, and it gives you some F statistics. A significant F would be anything bigger than 4. But in fact, those aren't really quite according to Hoyle's sorts of F statistics. They're sort of pseudo F statistics. That's how they're labeled, because there's a bit of backward causality there with create the variables are used to create the group. So it's kind of expected that the F statistics should be higher than you would expect. So you can't really use that to guide significance. But what I do is I would look at the ones, I would just eyeball it and say, hey, these ones look a lot higher than these other ones. I would focus on the highest ones, maybe the highest half or the highest third of the variables, depending on what number I was trying to get down to. Again, there's some judgment that happens there that doesn't happen when you're using those automatic variable selection methods, which is another reason I kind of like those automatic methods. I think we've got, oh, let's see. Does varcel LCM handle highly correlated variables? Question from Lou. No, Lou, unfortunately, varcel LCM really does the best job with masking variables. It doesn't seem to, I don't think it gets rid of correlated variables very well. Unfortunately, it's kind of the only game in town when you've got mixtures of scale types. And so even though it doesn't handle correlated variables very well, when I do have mixed scale types, I'll oftentimes do the varcel LCM to get rid of redundant variable, or to get rid of masking variables, and then follow it up with like a correlation analysis to help me get rid of correlated variables. Well, we've got another one came in here. To your point, are there cases where useful profiling variables can be used as a dependent variable and help us select variables for entry to the segmentation? That's a good question. Again, in the day-long class, we cover a lot of stuff we didn't get to today. There's kind of a middle ground between supervised segmentation and unsupervised. It's a specific variable selection step that I call predictive segmentation. So if there was one profiling variable of particular interest, I might say, well, of all my basis variables, which ones are the ones that are most highly correlated with that one, and then use correlation with that one interesting profiling variable to select my basis variables for my segmentation. If my sample size were big enough, if I had a really big sample size, I'd probably run this as a supervised segmentation. But I do a lot of B2B work. And in my B2B studies, I just don't have the sample size to run a tree-based supervised segmentation model. But what I will do is I'll kind of trick the analysis. I'll use this. I'll say, hey, I've got a dependent variable. What's correlated with my dependent variable? And then I'll segment on those correlated variables. I'll use that process as my variable selection step and get something like a sort of supervised segmentation. Again, it's kind of a middle ground, and the name I've heard that process called is predictive segmentation. It works real well in my B2B studies. Okay, I think we may be out of questions now. So
Thanks so much, Keith. You're a rock star, going above and beyond. Lots of questions answered there. We appreciate your expertise. Anything else from you, Brian or Keith?
thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for the great questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. And Brian, we do try to do one of these webinars every month. We'd love to see you guys every time. And with that, see you guys later. We'll wrap it up.